Good afternoon. My name is Howard Sewell, and I serve on the board of directors for the insurance group. I have the distinct pleasure today to present this webinar on general church safety inspections. I am also presenting from my home church, which is Mayflower Congregational UCC in Oklahoma City. And you'll see many pictures and videos used in this presentation that took here at my home church. Prior to serving on the board of directors, I worked in commercial business risk management for an insurance company for over 35 years. So before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping areas. Number one is this webinar is previously recorded. However, I am live in the chat box as well as other members of the insurance board to answer questions during and after the webinar. And to hopefully make this presentation even more engaging, I have questions embedded in some of the slides for you to answer, and I would encourage your participation. Also, if you could type in your name and where you're from, I would appreciate that, so I can log that in my memory. And as you're doing that, I would like to go over the goals and objectives. Number one is that the overall goal for you is to pick up information and tips and techniques for your church leadership to be able to identify safety hazards in and around your facility so that you can prevent accidents and prevent losses. Under the biblical adage of we are our brother's keepers, I think it's important that we maintain our facility and try to prevent accidents to both our employees and our visitors, as well as good stewardship of the facility itself. Within the objectives specifically, we're going to cover some of the major types of accidents and losses that occur within the churches. Secondly, is we're going to talk about strategies and processes and techniques to use for inspection to identify hazards, and most importantly, to come up with control measures to prevent accidents from occurring. I should mention that the insurance group is a collective of churches, so that when you have accidents and losses, they not only affect your individual church, but they also affect the collective as a whole, which could impact your insurance premiums and rates. And we're all trying to be mindful of our finances these days. As we go through this, as you have questions or input, you'll notice that there is a chat box that you can type in your questions or comments, and we will follow along. So let's get into it. So let's talk about the major loss areas and risks for churches. And we're going to start off with a question. Which of the following is not historically a big claim loss driver for churches? Here are the answers to choose from. Food poisoning, falls in parking lots, damage to roof from weather events, and auto crashes. So I'll pause for a moment while you type in which answer you think is not historically a big loss driver for churches. And the answer is food poisoning. Although food poisoning can occur during some of your food-related events that you might have at the church, they are not a big loss driver. They do not account for the number of claims nor the amount of losses that these others loss areas do: falls in parking lots, damage to roof from weather events, and auto crashes. So thank you for your participation on this particular slide. So let's move to the next one. Continuing to talk about major loss areas and risks, we've identified what is not a loss driver. Let's talk about some of the things that are loss drivers. So for workers' comp and general liability accidents, we're talking about employees and visitors, primarily fall accidents. And we have falls outside of the facilities and we have falls inside the facilities. When we're talking about falls outside the facilities, we're typically talking about trips and slips in the parking lot or on the sidewalks to visitors or perhaps employees. And they can occur certainly from moisture outside, snow, ice, water, rain, those types of things. When you have falls inside the facilities itself, we're looking at several specific areas. One is the entry and exit areas where you have a lot of traffic. Again, you may have moisture that might cause slips to occur. Restrooms and kitchen and dining areas. As I mentioned before, a lot of slips occur on wet surfaces, but you can also have trips over objects that are on the floors itself. And we'll get more into this as we carry on this presentation. When we talk about property damage of your facilities, we're primarily talking about weather events. We're talking about water infiltration, how water comes inside your facility. And typically we're talking about leaks through the roof or other parts of your structure from heavy rain, wind events. Could also be from broken or leaking plumbing. You can also have property damage related to weather events that affect your roof. You have damage to your roof from hail, wind, or heavy rains. And then lastly, we see losses from equipment damage. We're typically talking about heating and air conditioning units. Could also be other equipment that's either roof mounted or adjacent to the property itself. A lot of these happen from hail. And I should also mention that not only do we have the property damage, but you also have lack of energy efficiency if those fins get damaged on your HVAC units. So these are the types of losses that we see most often for churches. So let's move on to talking about inspections. And to begin with, let me ask you another question. Have you ever conducted a church safety inspection? I'm looking for a yes or a no answer. So I'll pause for a moment so you can type into the chat box and let's be honest. If you have not conducted a church safety inspection before, what are some of the reasons why you have not conducted a church safety inspection? Some of the more common things that I hear is that either you don't know how to do a church safety inspection, or maybe you don't have the time, or maybe you just don't think it'll make a difference. So we hope that this information provided during this webinar itself will show you, instruct you how to do the inspections and see how it can make a difference. Now that we've had a chance to see whether or not you're doing any church safety inspections and why or why not, let's talk about the 5 whys of inspections. Certainly the where is within the facilities and outside the facilities is where the inspections will be done. The why, one reason is that you have a legal duty to demonstrate that you're trying to provide a safe workplace for your employees and also for visitors to come. We also have a moral obligation, I believe, as well. So that's the why. The who should be involved, certainly church leadership. You may have staff involved. You could even have some lay leadership depending on their experience. If you have someone who is experienced in doing safety inspections, understands what to look for, that might be a good person to identify to help you with this project. When and how often? Certainly every day that you're in or around the facilities itself, you should be taking a look around, identifying hazards or behaviors that you see, and correcting those acute situations so that you don't have accidents. We also believe that you should conduct a quarterly documented self-inspection. And in terms of what to take a look at, we're going to talk about some of those exposures and hazards to take a look for as we go through this presentation. Certainly, we've already talked about some of the historic loss areas and how to do it. You should have a uniform way of doing it. We have some examples of safety inspections on the insurance board website, loss prevention website, for you to be able to take a look at, download, and be able to use. So let's talk about the safety inspection process, what and how. The first thing I'd like for you to do is to get the big picture. I've included a video here of my church. You drive or walk around your church and you're looking for various safety hazards and exposures that might need a more specific look or things to address a little bit later on. As you can see here, we are looking at the church van and into the parking lot. Here we take a look at any traffic concerns, lighting that might not be working. We're starting to see some of the property, the adjacent property itself. And you're getting a better idea of what's in and around the facility itself before making some specific looks. As we turn this last corner, we'll pull up closer to the other side of our property, and you see some work also at the end of this video as well. So again, get a big picture, make sure you know what's around your property before you take a more specific look. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is the potential for external risks. And you may have noticed towards the end of that other video, and you see now in this picture here, is there is some construction equipment and some work being done in and around the church property itself. So there's a concern perhaps for children, bystanders to get hurt playing on the equipment or playing around trenches or dirt piles. And so what I suggest when you have contractors on your premises, that you have a conversation with them about how they're protecting their equipment, how they're protecting some of these potential safety hazards. And you could also consider them, an insurance term, as an attractive nuisance, where a child sees something that looks like it might be fun to play on, but doesn't understand the inherent danger. So having these kind of conversations, not only with a contractor, but maybe daycare teachers and child education directors, will help steer the kids away from these particular external risks. So let's move into talking about the playgrounds itself. Most of the churches that I've seen have playgrounds. Some of them have a daycare services provided to their members or visitors. And these can be dangerous areas if they're not kept up. So when you take a look at playgrounds, again, take a look at the perimeter and make sure that you have appropriate fencing around there, that you have gates that are self-locking. And you want to make sure that these playgrounds are monitored at all times when there are children present. When you're taking a look at playgrounds, start with the ground itself. You're looking for any kind of sharp rocks or broken glass that might be present that could pose a hazard to the kids or to your employees itself. Secondly, you want to take a look at the playground equipment. Make sure there's no sharp edges there. For instance, exposed bolts or screws or broken pieces of equipment that might cut or injure a child. Additionally, you want to take a look and make sure the structure itself is sturdy and not going to collapse. Those are some specific things you want to take a look at, certainly every day. We also suggest that formally, at least once a year, that you or perhaps a contractor do a more thorough assessment of the playground, someone who understands national playground equipment standards. And speaking of that, when you have new playground equipment installed or remodeled, you want to look for those types of contractors that carry that type of endorsement. So let's move into talking more about traffic conditions, because the traffic flow can be a concern both for vehicle accidents and pedestrians. And as we see this sign, "Thou shalt yield," which perhaps may be the 11th commandment, pun intended, it does give some direction to drivers. So you're looking for places that could be drop-off spots, pickup spots around your facility itself. You want to make sure that those are clearly marked with signage and perhaps even marks on the pavement itself. There's some situations where you might have events or you may have auxiliary parking areas that might require crossing of streets. In those cases, you may want to take a look at hiring off-duty policemen to help in maintaining pedestrian crossings. Or if you do use staff, I would recommend that they go through a traffic training school, as well as learning how to use sign and directional signals, and of course, wearing the orange safety vests. Continue to move forward, we're going to talk about parking lot safety. And there's several things to keep in mind in terms of parking lots. Number one is the safety and security of folks when they come to your facility. When I talk about security, we could be talking about, again, uniformed police officers off duty helping you with certain events, or if you've had threats. It could also be that you have your own security personnel. And so making sure that they're aware of what the situation is and positioning those folks correctly for security's sake. Additionally, it might involve having cameras for surveillance, especially if you've had issues with theft itself. Making sure you have adequate lighting and that the lighting is maintained properly. And it could also be looking at the parking lot to make sure it's free of indentations and potholes and cracks and elevated surfaces that might cause trip accidents to occur. You can also take a look at curbs and parking stops that might trip people. Sometimes I've had folks paint those either yellow or orange to bring more visibility to that so they can prevent those trips and falls. Let's continue to move forward and talk about snow and ice removal procedures. Certainly this pertains to locations, some locations more than others, but we do encourage you to have a plan for snow and ice removal. Number one is you may have a contractor that you've hired to do this. Make sure that you have a contract with them and understand how quickly they can respond. If you don't have a contractor that you're working with and you're relying on staff or lay personnel, make sure that you have a plan associated with them that would include who's involved, when they're going to be engaged, what types of equipment's going to be used, what kind of chemicals are going to be used, and how they're going to properly protect themselves as well. One of the things that we do recommend is that in the entry and exit areas that you have enough matting, long enough mat or sequence of mats to be able to get the, for lack of a better term, the gunk off your shoes when you're walking in, especially from snow or ice events. Most studies have been done on slip and fall events indicate that you need a mat or mats 8 to 12 steps long enough to get the stuff off your feet. So those are things to take a look at, as well as having warning signs or cones available to warn people of moisture in the area. While we're continuing to talk about the outside of the facilities, let's don't forget about the top. So we're talking about roof and roof mounted equipment. When you're doing your quarterly inspections, take a look at the roof. Make sure that the tiles are in place, that there's no damage to piping, that you're not seeing any hail damage, that there's no ponding on flat roof areas or flashing problems. Those are all indications that you may have had some problems occur related to weather events. We'd also recommend that every 3 to 5 years that you have a roof contractor come and do a more thorough inspection of the roof and provide their expertise, because that can reduce a chance of some type of major repair in the future. So this is a very important piece to make sure your property is taken care of. as we talked about earlier, there's been some heavy losses related to property damage dealing with water infiltration. So let's talk more about the entry and exit areas of your churches. And we're going to start with a question. So when you take a look at this area here, the entry and exit area, where you have some covered area, what's your main concerns? And here are some of the things to choose from. Are you concerned about traffic? Are you concerned about falls? Are you concerned about life safety or emergencies? Or all of these? So if you can type in your answer or answers in the chat box. And of course, the answer is all three. We've talked a little bit about traffic situations. You can tell there's a pull-up area here for letting folks out or putting them or having them get back in their vehicles. So there's some issues with traffic. Certainly we talked about falls. We have a curb area and a slight ramp. If you have moisture there, you can have some slips and falls. And of course, if there was a crisis event, you would want to be able to make sure you can get out as quickly and as safely as possible. So life safety is a concern there as well. So good job on those answers. Let's move forward and talk about the mats, the good, the bad, and the ugly of mats. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of mats, but I do see that they are important in certain areas of the church. We talked about fall prevention, and mats can help you as far as fall prevention. It's much like real estate. It's location, location, location. You want mats in entry and exit areas. We talked about the appropriate length was 8 to 12 paces. And that may not be covered by one mat, but it might be covered by a series of mats. And when you talk about entry area mats, you're talking about mats that have a tapered or angled edge, a beveled edge, not a thick, flat edge that people can trip over. So those are the types of things we're looking for as far as entry and exit matting. You may also include mats in kitchen areas where water might get splashed on the floor, beverage serving areas, and perhaps even in restroom areas where water might get on the floor itself. The other thing to remember with mats is that they do need to be rotated and cleaned often. Otherwise, you're just tracking stuff all throughout the facility itself. So that's the good, the bad, and the ugly on mats. Moving forward, we're going to talk more about falls because falls is one of the leading types of accidents to both employees and to visitors. So let's start with a question. Why do falls occur? Some of the answers may include moisture, foreign objects on the floor, bad shoes, or clumsy people. Take a look at these answers and type in your answer or answers in the chat box. Falls generally occur due to moisture or foreign objects on the floor. Most people can recognize fall hazards and make adjustments, but they may not see wet floors and they may not notice, say, food on the floor, and it may cause them to slip and fall. I will talk a little bit more about shoes in a minute. I won't talk so much about clumsy people, though. So let's move ahead and continue to talk about falls inside. And here we have a picture of a restroom area. So the question I have for you now is what locations in the church pose a high risk of falls? And we've covered some of this already. So here's the answers to choose from. Stairs, restroom. This picture might give you a clue. Entry and exit areas, and the kitchen. So type in the chat box, enter any or all of these answers. And of course, the answer is all of these. They can pose a high risk of falls. We haven't talked about stairs. We'll mention that in a minute. This particular restroom area, you may notice that the sink is here. We don't see the paper towel or dryer dispenser. So the assumption is, and you would be correct, that the paper towel dispenser is to the far left. In other words, you have to wash your hands and then walk across the floor to get your hands dry. So you have a chance of dripping water on the floor. So when you're talking about redesigning or where to put your dryers and your hand towels, we would suggest adjacent to the sink so you're not dripping water across the floor. Let's continue to talk about falls inside. I have a video on this particular slide that is of our sanctuary. Once again, I talked about the fact that a lot of falls occur inside, both to visitors and employees. And if we can do one thing if we can concentrate on one thing, that would be reducing falls from inside risk and controlling those much better. So let's take a look at the next slide on specific fall prevention measures that we can implement or improve within our church facilities to hopefully reduce the chance of fall accidents. First, we have certainly taking care of the floors on a daily basis, cleaning them and sweeping them, making sure they're free of foreign objects. And then you'll have a regular cleaning, deep cleaning of the floors, and perhaps that's with a contractor itself, or you may have staff that do that. One thing I should mention is that you want to make sure you're using the proper chemicals for your flooring and the proper tools itself as well. There's some enzymatic cleaners that are activated by proper water temperatures. It might be hot or it may be cold. So make sure you read the directions and you also use the proper types of mops or perhaps deck brushes to clean the floor. We've talked a lot about proper care and use of mats, making sure that you rotate those and clean those on an ongoing basis. Making sure you try to remove some of your trip hazards. And what I mean by trip hazards, typically things that are below eyesight, perhaps even below knee level. Sometimes I see stools and boxes and other types of objects that might be on around the floor that might cause a trip hazard to someone. I'm also a big believer of using tall wet floor signs or cones. And what I mean by tall is like 36 inches high, things that you can actually see and warn you of the particular hazard. Certainly you want to clean up spills as soon as possible. Have things available to do that, whether it be paper towels or rags in those areas where moisture might accumulate. We want to talk about check the stair treads and railings to make sure they're firmly in place, that they're sturdy, and hopefully prevent any type of trips up or down the stairs. And for employees, I would highly recommend that they wear non-slip shoes when they're at work, because that's going to give you a much better chance of recovering if you do have a slip itself. Probably can't mandate that, but if you can recommend it, they'll probably be influenced by that. Lastly is if you're remodeling any part of your facility or perhaps even building a new facility itself, talk with your architects or contractors about installing more slip resistant floors. They may be just as cheap as other types of floors you might be considering, but they offer a higher level of slip resistance and can reduce the risk of fall accidents within your facilities. So these are some of the fall prevention measures that I would definitely take a look at to minimize your risk of fall accidents. We're going to move on to talking about kitchen risks, and I have a video of my church kitchen here that we're going to follow along and see that certainly within the kitchen, the most dangerous thing might be fires that could occur. We're talking about making sure your ovens and gas piping and stoves are in good working order And certainly your fire suppression equipment is inspected and maintained on a regular basis. When we talk about employee or visitor type of potential risk, we're looking at burns, again with the stoves and ovens, making sure you have oven mitts available, any pots that you're using to heat up, making sure they're not overfilled and they're easier to dispense using ladles and so forth. Cuts are certainly a frequent type of accident in the kitchen. A lot of those occur due to dull knives. So make sure you have a knife sharpening program in place. Also, you want to have a cut resistant or Kevlar glove to use in your offhand. So when you're cutting up vegetables or fruit or what have you, it's protecting that offhand. We talked about falls quite a bit, making sure you have a good floor cleaning procedures in the kitchen, making sure mats are in appropriate places. The one thing we have not talked about is the potential for strain injuries, back and shoulder strains from lifting and moving equipment or materials. So when you're ordering products, say for instance, rice, instead of maybe getting the 50-pound bag of rice, which might be a little bit more economical, maybe a 25-pound might be easier for someone to handle. Also take a look at how and where you store things so that they're in the power range between kind of your knees and your shoulders, so you're able to lift and move things more adequately. Use of carts and two-wheelers are certainly recommended to reduce the chance of strain injuries occurring as well. So these are some of the kitchen risk and controls that I want you to be aware of within your church facilities. Let's talk a little bit more, let's move on to life safety and crisis management. And when I talk about different types of crisis, we're talking about the potential for fire, and we don't see that many fires in the loss events that you're having, but they certainly are potential and can ravage the facility as well as causing all kind of other disruptions. But certainly we all have weather-related events that we've talked about where you've had heavy losses, which could include high wind, heavy rain events, certainly tornadoes in where I live, although they're becoming a little bit more active in other areas, maybe perhaps due to climate change. It's a whole other topic. Floods and hurricanes. So these are the types of weather-related crises that we're wanting to make sure we have plans for and manage. The other thing that's gotten a lot of press these days is certainly active shooter. We want to have plans in place to try to deal with those situations. God forbid they occur. Continuing to talk about life safety and crisis management, let's talk a little bit more about security. So when we talk about security, you want to at least annually make sure you reviewed your written plan for some of the major crises that I talked about in the prior slide. You want to make sure that you have proper training for your staff and critical lay members that might be involved in some of the crisis management, and make adjustments in those plans accordingly. Certainly, if you can, I would recommend a mock drill, whether it be a fire drill or maybe an active shooter, shelter in place, tornado shelter. And if you can, invite some of your emergency management personnel, maybe it's the local fire department, to review the drill itself to make sure it's being executed according to plan. You also want to make sure that you have your security and monitoring contractors evaluate any cameras or security doors that you might have to make sure they're being monitored properly, as well as the signage that's working and directing you accordingly to, say, for instance, the exit. So these are some of the things to make sure you keep in mind for crisis management and review these things at least annually. Now that we've covered all of these things during this presentation in terms of church inspections, understanding risk and controls, let's summarize and take any questions you might have. First, let's remind ourselves of why we're doing this. One is that it's a legal obligation to provide a safe workplace for our employees and to visitors. Secondly, it's a moral and even a biblical obligation, as I mentioned earlier. We are all our brother's keepers. Who should be involved? Once again, should be church leadership directing this. You may have staff involved and lay leadership, particularly those people who may have been involved in inspection processes in the past. When and how often? Every day you should be looking in and around your facility to identify any acute issues and take care of them on a daily basis. Additionally, we recommend that you do a quarterly documented self-inspection using some of the forms that we have on the Loss Prevention Insurance Board website. The things that you're looking for, the what, again, we're looking for areas where you've had historic losses, and most specifically is falls inside and outside the facilities itself, as well as property damage from weather-related events, particularly roof and equipment. Once again, on the how, utilizing some of the documents that we have available on the loss prevention website is recommended. So once again, I'd like to thank you for your participation in this presentation itself. Thanks for the engagement. We look forward to more presentations as we move forward. And again, I'll pause and we'll stay on the chat box to answer any questions you might have concerning this or anything related to it. Once again, thank you very much.